technically, you could become the most powerful person on the planet, getting only 0.000001065% of the vote. See, in the US, people don't vote directly for president. Instead, each state gets a certain number of votes, and with only 2 minor exceptions, whoever wins in a given state gets all of its votes. So if only one person votes in each of these states and they all vote for you, you would get all 270 of those states' votes, just enough to make you president, even if all voting age Americans in all the other states were to vote against you. Remember, and keep this in mind, we're talking about selecting a person for the most powerful position on the planet, because it only gets dumber from here. For starters, we can take this all the way down to a flat 0%, netting you upwards of 415 of these state votes. See, these votes are not just numbers, but people. And I mean actual real human beings known as electors who act as sort of a middleman. Each candidate has their own set of these, and whenever they win a state, their electors just get to be that state's middleman. Hence the name, the Electoral College. However, these electors don't actually have to vote for their own candidate. They can choose to vote for another guy, becoming a so-called faithless elector. A few states do have laws that reject these votes, others simply punish faithless electors, and some don't do anything at all. Regardless, 415 are still technically on the table. Now just imagine some obscure third-party candidate just yoinking away these votes for the presidency like Kanye West, who ran in 2020.
I see good things about Hitler.
Okay, something like that's never actually gonna happen in the real world. But that doesn't mean that we can just ignore this whole faithless elector thing, as it has been sort of a joker card throughout history that almost caused a few straight up dumpster fires. Now, but let's put this to the side for a moment and talk about something else that's borderline just as stupid as a 0-vote president, but which as recently as 2020 was a mere 43,000 votes from happening. A few times throughout history, a person has become president without getting the most votes simply by winning the Electoral College. And every time this has happened, it's been rather controversial. But what if you could become president without winning either of these? In 2020, Trump lost in Georgia by 12,000 votes, Wisconsin 20,000, and Arizona a mere 11,000. Had he won those states, it would have tied the Electoral College 269 to 269. Nice. But this is also where it gets incredibly stupid. See, in this case, the House of Representatives would get to decide. The House being one of the US's 2 parliaments where each state gets a number of representatives roughly based off population. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking that if the House is to decide the presidency, that each representative would get a vote. But you would actually be wrong. Instead, each state gets one single vote that their representatives have to agree on. Wyoming, 600,000 people. 1 vote. California, 40 million people. 1 vote sounds fair. And in 2020, the Republicans had a majority in 26 of the 50 states. Hence, Trump gets his second term despite losing by 8 million votes, not winning the Electoral College, and not even having an actual majority in the House of Representatives. That was 43,000 votes away. Oh, and then there's the vice president who would be chosen by America's second parliament, the Senate, which contains 2 senators from each state, which in 2020 had 50 right-wingers to 50 left-wingers. In other words, one of the 2 sides would have to cave in. Good luck. But if you think 2020 nearly became a disaster, then I don't know what 2004 could have been. In that election, Republican George W. Bush beat Democrat John Kerry by 3 million votes. But if we change a grand total of 37,500 votes across these 3 states, suddenly it's another tie. Except, remember these faithless electors. See, in the lead up to 2004, one Bush elector from West Virginia made it very clear that he saw Bush as being unfit to run the country and therefore strongly considered voting for another candidate. Being a lifelong Republican, he did know that he wasn't enthusiastic about voting for Kerry. But and I quote, "I'm looking at what my options are when it comes time to vote." Had it been a draw, this would have been his options. Oh, and on top of all this, he later became a Democrat. Could you imagine that dumpster fire? Oh look, Minnesota is here to screw things up even further. In 2004, one Democratic elector from Minnesota accidentally cast her presidential vote, not for John Kerry, but his vice presidential running mate. In the real world, this of course didn't matter at all. However, in this hypothetical scenario, it would have brought John Kerry down to 269, where, he's still ahead. But let's have a little look at what the US Constitution says triggers these ridiculous House elections. If no person have a majority, 269 is only half of the total 538, not a majority. Okay, I get it. We just spent all that time reaching the conclusion that tiebreak elections don't just get triggered in the event of a tie. But even if just no candidate manages to reach 270. But what if I were to tell you that this minute little detail is actually one of the most fatal flaws with the US election system? A flaw that a few people have attempted to exploit over the years, some of them nearly even succeeding. For example, this guy.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Throughout the 1960s, black people, even in the Deep South, had gotten rights. And some people found that unacceptable. One of them, former Alabama Governor George Wallace, the guy from the clip I just showed you, thought he could do something about this by running for president, except the presidency itself wasn't the goal. He was way too racist for that, and he kinda knew it. Instead, his strategy was to just win the southern states, thereby denying the other two candidates a majority. Thereafter, he could use the southern states in the House of Representatives to sort of bargain away the presidency in exchange for state independence on, among other things, civil rights. And the man almost succeeded. With 13.5% of the national vote, he managed to capture 46 electoral votes, one of them actually being a faithless elector. Although that nor any of his other votes would wind up mattering, as Richard Nixon would capture 301, easily making him president. Racism averted. But just barely. See, remember in the beginning when I said that whoever wins in a given state, even if just by one single vote, gets all of that state's electoral votes? Well, in many of Nixon's states, including his 4 largest, the runner-up Hubert Humphrey came within just a few percent of flipping them, with any 2 of these top 4 being enough to send Nixon below 270, making Wallace's attempt a very close call, although nowhere near as close as in 1948, when this guy attempted basically the exact same thing. A man even more racist than George Wallace, famous for once speaking for 24 hours and 18 minutes straight in an attempt to derail a civil rights bill. Dude. Anyway, the man's name is Thurmont, and in 1948 he ran for president, and with just 2.4% of the national vote, gained almost as many electoral votes as Wallace did in '68. The key difference being that where Nixon won his largest states by a few percent, the winner in 1948, Harry Truman, won his largest states by less than 1%, making this an even closer call. I mean, honestly, is it that unthinkable to imagine some radical faction, even in our day and age, breaking away from their party to use this strategy in an attempt to force through some crazy policy? I mean, honestly, if that were to succeed, people would literally be out rioting in the streets. Which sort of makes you wonder, back in the late 1960s, with those 2 very uncomfortable close calls within just a 20-year period, how on earth could the American people still support this election system? Truth is, they didn't. A poll conducted shortly after the 1968 election showed 80% of correspondents in favor of abolishing it. Therefore, on this day, the House of Representatives voted on whether or not to abolish it. 339 in favor, 70 against. Now it's just on to the second parliament, the Senate.
Here's Johnny.
In this Senate, our little friend from 1948, who almost benefited so greatly from the Electoral College, Thurmont, who was then senator from South Carolina, was waiting. And alongside a few of his fellow segregationist senators, he was going to fight this proposal tooth and nail. They started off using various different delay tactics, ultimately getting the vote postponed by a whole year, during which time Thurmont in particular was very busy recruiting new allies, as the South alone wasn't big enough to kill this amendment. And he did such a good job at this that by September 1970, this proposal, which I remind you 80% of Americans supported, and which had breezed through the House of Representatives, was effectively dead. Now, I might have finished that story a bit abruptly, but that's because it contains one little detail that's just so completely insane that it's even more important than the entire story itself. That little detail being one of the organizations that Thurmont managed to recruit, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Let that sink in for a moment. Thurmont, one of the most notorious segregationists of all time, managed to win over one of the largest black rights activist groups in the country. Yet the craziest thing is that alliance is not even as weird as it sounds. See, anyone who has ever read anything about the history of the Electoral College, and you know, I've read a little bit, will have noticed that most US politicians don't give a and base their entire opinions off of whether or not the system benefits them. In the lead up to the 2000 election, it looked as though Republican George W. Bush was going to get the most votes but lose the Electoral College to Democrat Al Gore, who therefore began gathering historians and legal scholars alike to help him defend this age-old institution. Bush, on the other hand, created a massive advertising campaign aimed at making Democratic electors turn faithless and obey the will of the people. Although when election day came around and gave us the exact opposite results, both candidates more or less did a complete 180. With a slightly broader perspective, we also noticed that in the early 1900s, it was primarily left-wing progressives who did not want to change the election system. I wonder why. Yet since the 1980s, it's basically just been defended by right-wingers. Except for one moment in the early 2010s, when the Democrats looked borderline unbeatable, at which point most Republicans suddenly wished to abolish it. One of them even going as far as to call it a disaster for a democracy. However, 4 years later, when this exact same person became president without getting the most votes, he had suddenly figured out that it's in fact genius. The point being that whether you're a Democrat, Republican, or an ardent supporter of the guns and dope party, no matter which party, the Electoral College has the potential to both screw you over and give you an unfair advantage. Combine that with the many ridiculous and borderline dangerous pitfalls built straight into this system for electing the most powerful person on the planet, and you'll likely see it in the same way that notable founding fathers Thomas Jefferson and James Madison saw it: one big flaw with an otherwise great country. Although by no means the only flaw with the US, it has plenty others. One problem in particular is actually rather interesting and, moreover, not something that you would expect to even be a problem in the first place. So perhaps you should click on this video and find out more.